Welcome back to Citizens Forum. This is segment 4. And today we have with us David Murner. David is the Vice President of Fairvote Canada. And it's a very prominent organization in Canada that's helping to organize the discussion around what type of electoral system we're going to have. Basically looking at some type of proportional representation. David also was a candidate here for the Liberal Party candidate here in Victoria. Was it in Esquimalt, you say?
Esquimalt, Saanich, that's right.
And so I think we should start off by just asking that question. What is the Liberal Party of Canada's preferred type of proportional representation?
Well, in the last election when we ran on a process, not an outcome. So we said, let's hold hearings across the country. Let's listen to Canadians and try and figure out what are Canadians saying. This is a complicated topic. What kind of model do we want? I think it's fair to say that there are some Liberals who push for proportional representation, like me, but there are others who aren't sold on it yet. So I think there's a lot of listening and learning going on this year with the Parliamentary Committee.
Now that's what I was going to say. There's a committee called the Electoral Reform Committee.
Yes.
And just describe to us what that committee is and how it's operating.
Well, it's a 12-member committee of the House of Commons. There are 5 Liberals, 3 Conservatives, 2 NDP, and 1 Green and 1 Bloc. And it's unusual to have the Green and the Bloc on these committees. They all have a vote, which is also unusual. Yeah. It was a controversial issue as to how they should form the committee, but the Liberals basically said, we'll do it according to proportional representation, according to the vote. And now, actually, the Liberals don't even have a controlling majority on the committee. So they're saying, let's have an open discussion, figure out what the best system is, try and come up with a consensus, and then bring in legislation. So that's the process we committed to.
Are there going to be hearings, or how are they going about it?
The committee's going to travel the country, listen to Canadians. Organizations like Fairvote Canada are going to make submissions on here are the possible models, here's some of the values that we care about in our electoral system, and there'll be a discussion.
Do you know when they might be coming to Victoria?
They haven't set the dates yet. They've had, I think, a couple of meetings to get organized, but I don't think they've set the dates yet.
So, you know, there's a whole lot of things to think about here. And we've gone through some discussion in BC about proportional representation too. And I guess what I'm wondering, and a lot of people are wondering, is what is probably the best bet of what we're going to end up with at the end of this process? What would that look like? Let's say one model that you think would be reasonable.
It's a really tough question. It's hard to predict. And I think it depends where you are in the country as to what model you like. In British Columbia, the STV, single transferable vote model, we had a referendum on it. It's quite popular. What it does is, rather than marking an X on a ballot like we do now, you actually get to rate your candidates, you know, 1 to 10, or depending on how many candidates are in the riding. And that gives voters a really big say on who they prefer. And you run that on a multiple member riding. So rather than just electing 1 MP, you have a choice of maybe electing 4 or 5 MPs. It depends on the plan, on the model.
In a region instead of a constituency?
So one idea for Vancouver Island would be, say, 4 MPs on the South Island up to Nanaimo, and then 3 on the North Island. Though they're bigger ridings.
Remember, that was sort of like a mixed member proportional representation where you did directly elect some, and some were appointed by the party affiliations.
Yes, the NDP ran on that last time. In the last election, 2015, they were saying, let's go with MMP. You elect your MP locally in the same way that we do now, but then you have what are called top-up MPs from regional MPs, and those top-up MPs are allocated according to what makes a proportional result.
Do you think that's a complicated system? Would that be hard for the voter to understand?
You know, there's a lot of complexity in this. That's one of the problems in explaining it and selling it to Canadians, is there is a lot of complexity. You'd have a ballot for MMP with sort of 2 lists, one for the local person and then one for the regional person, right? So that's a factor. STV has 1 long list, but let's say you had 4 candidates running at the same time, 4 or 5 parties, you know, you could have 20 candidates, so it makes for longer ballots. So
Yeah.
those are some of the complexities that you'd be facing.
So single transferable vote, say if there's, say 3 people running, make life easy.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, and say one candidate gets the most votes,
Yeah.
but doesn't have 50% of the vote. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, it's a little more complicated than
Okay.
that. But let's say it was a 3-person riding,
Yeah.
right? And you might have 12 candidates, 3
Yeah.
times 4 parties. It depends where you are in the country, right?
Yeah.
And so it depends on how many seats you have and what it takes to sort of make the cutoff.
Yeah.
Because the complexity for STV isn't in the voting. It's really easy to vote. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
Put your preferences down, all on one list, organized by party.
Yeah.
It's in the counting. And the counting essentially goes like this. You need to pass a certain number of votes in order to win.
Yeah.
And it depends on a formula,
Right.
which is complicated.
Yeah.
So for the voters, it's not complicated, but for the counters, it is.
Yeah.
They have to keep track.
See, why I ask is because, of course, you check the numbers the day after the election, and one guy got 5,000, the other guy got 3,000, the guy with 5,001,
It's easy.
and off you go for a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Because it's just that easy to compare. But now, one of the issues for me would be to actually, I want to check. I want to make
Yes.
sure they did this right.
And can you follow up?
Can I do that?
They do this in Ireland now, and it is complicated, and sometimes it takes until the next day to make sure you've got the votes right, and the parties scrutinize everything right, so
Right.
they'd be in there making sure the count is done properly. But because of the way STV works, you're allocating votes,
Yeah.
and so it's a more complicated count.
Okay, I'm going to throw a curveball at you because
Okay.
I know, like what I always think about is, okay, you're running. Say if we go into another type of like mixed member proportional representation where parties put on a slate of candidates.
Yeah.
What if you watch what's happening in the United States right now in the presidential elections and
Yeah.
primaries,
Yeah.
and you see all the shenanigans that are going on and how they're choosing their candidates.
Yes.
And you
Yeah.
realize that, if that candidate hasn't been chosen in a democratic way,
Yeah.
how can the voters really get a choice? So would electoral reform also include that process of how candidates are chosen?
The nomination process is a party, usually run by the parties.
Yeah.
And each party has a different approach.
Yeah.
One of the things the Liberal parties just did in their convention was say, we're going to throw out this idea that you have to buy a $10 membership and
Yeah.
become a member and show up to a nomination meeting. We're going to try and really open up our nomination process.
Yeah.
And so that's one big change that I think a lot of the parties will look
Yeah.
at. Another thing is that the United States, it's very adversarial, right? Their politics is
Yeah.
very tough, very adversarial, a 2-party system basically, right? And what we're interested in is saying, let's change the dynamics of politics. Let's get away from this fight. Let's try and create a political system where there's more collaboration.
Yeah.
And that's the advantage of proportional representation. It changes this dynamic. You're
Yeah.
encouraged to collaborate. If I'm running next time and I want you might be NDP or something, but I still would love you to give me your second or third or fourth choice vote, right?
Yeah.
It changes the way people talk to each other, changes the way they relate to each other. I think that's the key difference is we won't have this US dynamic you're talking about of these very tough battles, very adversarial.
Yeah.
It's been the case in Canada too. The last election was a long, tough battle.
Well, often without those complexities in a discussion, you'll have 2 parties fighting it out when the real issues are not even within the parameters of the discussion.
Yes, yeah.
And like I've spent most of my life outside those parameters myself. So,
Yeah.
it's so easy to give up.
Yes.
Pe-
Yeah.
I think this to me is probably the most exciting part for me is the thought that your vote is not going to be wasted.
Yeah.
If you get out there and vote, I think
Yeah.
we'd see a lot more participation.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think, especially now, for instance, in the demographics of voting, you find that older people tend to vote more than younger
Yes,
people.
yeah.
When the younger people have their futures here.
Yeah, exactly.
So you
Well,
want
I
to get
won't
more
ask you about
involved.
your politics, Walter, but it's true. I mean, if you're a Green voter right
Yeah.
now, you have a chance of winning 1, maybe 2
Yeah.
seats. And but if you looked at the number of Canadians who actually voted Green, you would deserve on a proportional system 11 or 12 people, right? And so our system discourages voters. We lose a lot of voters who say, my vote doesn't really count, right? I'm in a riding where a Green will never get elected, so why bother, right?
I know that. No, that is refreshing. And what will happen now? Say, for instance, once this committee is done, they give their report to the government, and what happens after that?
Legislation is introduced, and this
Okay.
will be the key. What does the legislation say? Does it define a proportional representation model or some other kind of model? And hopefully the committee will come out with a recommendation. And of course, as part of Fairvote Canada, I'm hoping it's a proportional representation recommendation. I'm not strongly wedded to STV, MMP, or any particular model, as long as it's proportional.
Yeah.
So you can't get 39% of the vote and win 100% of the power like Harper did, or Justin Trudeau did.
Well, these false majorities have always been problematic, and I think also it wrenches the country around.
Yes.
We were going in one direction, now we're going in another.
Yeah.
The public never knows for sure what the heck is that direction.
Yeah.
And it might add more voices into the mix.
Yes, I think that's right. And the academics who study these things call it policy lurch, where you're lurching back and forth with these sort of false majorities or majorities that aren't really elected majorities, at 39% forming 100% of the power. So the argument from many academics is if you have a proportional representation, you're more likely to get gradual policy change. And frankly, from a partisan liberal perspective, my sense is that if you're in the middle of the road, you're more likely to be able to make deals with everybody and say, well, let's work together on green issues.
And more parties will become more like that.
And more collaborative.
Now, if people want to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
Fairvote Canada has a website. Google Fairvote Canada and fairvote.ca. There's lots of information on there, videos, explanations on how the different models work and so on.
That's wonderful, David. Really love to have you. And hopefully we'll see you again in the next few months as things evolve.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on your show.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
So that wraps up Citizens Forum for this week, and we'll see you next week.